Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. On yesterday's Take 5, I was talking about Jimmy Carter, who friends of mine have called the worst US president in their lifetime, but the best ex-president that they ever had. Certainly one president who had a very firm born-again experience, but not a president that most of us on this side of the Atlantic would be aware of, was a guy called James Garfield. Garfield grew up in northeastern Ohio in absolute poverty. He was born in a log cabin, and he left home at the age of 16 to work on the canals. He actually was looking after the mules that would pull the barges along the canals. And after a while of doing this, he went home, he was sick, and during his time of illness, his mother extracted a promise from him that he would go back to school for a year. And well, the school he went back to was actually a seminary, and he studied there for 3 years. And in the last year of his seminary, he came to an absolute life-changing experience of Jesus Christ. And James Garfield ended up being baptized in an icy river. And he became a preacher. He was a circuit preacher. He used to travel around, had a network of churches that he would ride round, and he would on horseback, and he would minister at all these different churches and preach in them one after another. The old circuit riding preacher idea that was fairly common in the United States at that time. Now, James Garfield, because of his biblical beliefs, had an absolute horror of slavery. He just saw slavery as an absolute attack on the dignity of man as being made in the image of God. It was the pro-life issue of the day. And so James Garfield got involved in politics. And he only got involved in politics because of his opposition to slavery. And he actually ended up in the Civil War. He ended up as a general in the Union Army in the Civil War, where, of course, slavery was one of the root issues of that war. And then while he was actually still in military service, there was a congressional election coming up for the 19th district in Ohio. And some friends persuaded him to allow his name to be put forward. And he said he would do it on one condition, that he would not campaign. He would not conduct a political campaign. He would not make any speeches. He would not knock any doors. He would not put himself forward in any way. If others wanted to do that, that was up to them. But he basically signed the papers to be a candidate and then went back to his work in the US Army. And he was elected, and he ended up in Congress. Now, he was probably the most unpolitical politician that the United States has ever seen. He did not believe in putting himself forward. Many times there were key positions within government and Congress that he could have easily obtained for himself, but he just wouldn't put himself forward. And in fact, you might be saying, well, how did he become president then? Well, what happened was that the Republican Party were trying to choose their next candidate for president. And there were two potential candidates, both former generals in the Union Army. One was General Grant and the other was General Sherman. And James Garfield was actually, he was involved in putting one of the other guys up and supporting them. And the problem was that the party was just tied. They couldn't decide whether Grant or Sherman should be their candidate for the presidency. And so eventually they said, well, look, as a compromise, let's pick somebody else. What about James Garfield? And everyone said yes. So he ended up becoming the presidential candidate without ever putting himself forward to do so. And he was elected as president of the United States. Now, sadly, James Garfield only served for 6 months as president. He was assassinated. Nothing to do with anything he had done. It was a delusional character, a lot of infighting that was going on at the time. But he served 6 months before he was assassinated. So James Garfield is remembered certainly as one of the shortest presidential tenures that were ever held. He was also the guy, but he is remembered as the guy who never politicked, who never put himself forward, and yet still ended up becoming president of the United States. You know, the Bible tells us that promotion does not come from the north, the south, the east, or the west. Promotion comes from the Lord. And Garfield is absolutely an instance of where we see a man who was put in that position by God, not by his own politicking, not by conniving, not by any of the kind of stuff that we think is part and parcel of politics today, but simply God put him in a position, a man who was devoted to preaching the gospel, a man who was devoted to ending slavery, and a man who was devoted to serving his country and eventually died in the service of his country as the president who was assassinated. So today, as we remember James Garfield, I would encourage you, sometimes it may seem like you're not getting the rewards that your effort deserves. Sometimes you may see other people and they seem to be getting the prominence rather than you. I want to encourage you, trust in God. God has a place for each of us. God has a plan for each of us. And if we keep him first and serve him, Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. May God help us to keep Jesus first today in all that we do and say. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.